Why did you say
Moron,
you do this?
there's too many clans.
You have ADHD.
Robots.
You don't even like most of these.
Stupid.
How are you supposed to focus on
Why
things
is
you
there
don't
so
like?
much Bermuda? Optimus Prime.
Hello everyone and welcome back to... we're finally here. Finally at part 2. If you haven't watched the first one, go watch that. Same disclaimer I put there applies here. A lot of this would have been a lot more difficult if it weren't for Solemn's article on ZeroDamageGaming on getting into premium. And if you haven't seen that, then what the heck are you doing here, dude? But we're gonna go through the rest of the clans. We're gonna get through it. I promise. Here we go. You done? All right. Starting us off, we're gonna go into OTT with Sterling Witch Momo. This is just a very generic restander and also buffs your front row a lot. So this is just very generically useful for anything you're gonna be doing. Next, we have Ichikishima, the one that isn't banned. This is gonna be your finisher. This just draws you 2 cards and heavily guard restricts your opponent. And if you use it with Silent Tom, your opponent actually can't guard at all. So strong finishing power there. We also have Floral Witchmaster Mimi for witches. This is honestly a very good first stride other than Momo, because you can play Momo and witches as well. But this is interesting because it doesn't require any resources and it forces your opponent to discard 2 cards or they automatically take a damage with all trigger effects nullified. Also wanted to include a Battle Sister option since Fromage is coming out in clan selection. This just basically lets you play the same sort of ability that Fromage does. Looking at our G Guardians, we have Lozengemega's Apex. Did you bring your mouse? This just lets you check the top 2 cards of your deck, draw one, send the other to the bottom. We also have Amaterasu who gains 10k shield, lets you soul charge and check the top card of your deck and put it on the top or bottom, so it kind of lets you scry for triggers. And lastly, we have a Battle Sister G-Guard, but this works with everything. This just draws you a card and lets you check the top card. If it's a grade 1 or higher, it gets plus 5k shield, and then you can put it on the top or bottom of your deck. So just more scrying for triggers, very OTT. Looking at Angel Feather now, we have Gavriel Eden. This just lets you do a rescue check, basically heal a damage and then take a damage, digging for more trigger checks, you know, like standard Gavriel. And when it attacks, you can multi-attack and toolbox from your damage zone. Next, we have the other Gavriel Stride. This is just essentially your standard Gavriel play, but at GB2 and an extra drive check, I guess. Then we have last year's Premium Collection Stride for Angel Feather, which is a very interesting card. At GB3, it extends your damage zone to 7, and then if you have 5 face-up cards in your damage zone, it extends your damage zone to 8. And then her other ability is a Guard Restrict that forces your opponent to call the same amount of cards from hand as are in your damage zone. We also have Altiel, which is basically just a mini GB8 for the deck. Speaking of the GB8, this heals up to 5 damage and deals you a damage for each one you healed, so basically giving you a octuple check. There's also Holy Seraph Raphael. Really simple ability, flip up a copy of it and you heal yourself a damage. I also wanted to include her Premium Collection version. It's not as good and people don't play it, but I really like the art and it's basically the same thing except with a cost of Counterblast 3 and instead you heal 2 cards instead of just 1. Nobody really plays this, but I just think it's interesting. Also wanted to include the Nociel Stride because Nociel actually did really well in a tournament a few months ago or weeks ago, however long ago it was. Just another multi-attack and toolbox from damage. Into G-Guards, we have Eleth who just gains a ton of shield depending on how much damage you have. Suriel who scries the deck and then heals and deals you a damage in the middle of your opponent's battle phase, which is really good. And lastly, we have Parashel, just gains shield based on the amount of your face down damage up to 20k. Looking at Kagero now, we'll start off with Dumjid Valor, your 2019 Premium Collection Stride. Has an on-place target retire on your opponent's board, gains plus 15k for that, and whenever your opponent places a G-Guardian or a Sentinel, he restands and loses a drive. Next, we have Flare Arm Ziegenberg, very similar to Dumjid. On place, you choose one of your opponent's rear guards and retire it, and at the end of his battle, you can discard as many cards as your opponent has rear guards, restand him, and he gets drive -2. I also wanted to include Zanbus Dragon, last year's Premium Collection Stride. It's a nice tech option to have to just nuke your opponent's entire board for free. Draconic Overlord the Purge is a very interesting card as well. It works better in Overlord, but is useful in any Kagero deck. If you're playing it in Overlord, you can give your opponent an automatic damage if they're at 4 or less, and you nullify all trigger effects for that damage check. And his GB3, which is usable in any Kagero deck, gives him the same amount of drive checks as your opponent has damage. So up to 5, or if you're playing as Angel Feather, 7, I guess. Looking at Kagero's G-Guardians, there's really only one you need to concern yourself with, and that's Denial Griffin, who just kills one of your opponent's rearguards that is attacking. We also have Advanced Guard Dragon, who just targets and nukes one of your opponent's rested grade 1 rearguards. We have Abd Salam, who just gains 10k shield. And for Overlord specifically, we have Defeat Flare Dragon, who nukes your opponent's entire back row. This is also really nice because it gets around resist, because it's not actually targeting or choosing them, it just blows them up. Into Narukami. For Narukami, there's really only one stride you need to concern yourself with, and that's Stunverse Dragon, because literally his whole goal is to just get out of the way so that you can play Vanquisher. He's useful for other decks as well, but he binds up to 4 of your opponent's rearguards and cards from drop zone, and for every 4 cards in your opponent's bind zone, you draw a card, and then he destrides so that you can just play your standard deck. It's really dumb. I also wanted to include Draconic Vanquisher V-Buster though. He binds a rear guard and a card from drop zone, and if your opponent has 7 cards in their bind zone, he gets a drive and a crit and plus 5k power, and this is all very free, which is very nice. VMAX is also a very interesting option because for every face-up Vanquisher you have in G-Zone, he battles a unit on your opponent's board, and at the end of his battle, if your opponent has no rear guards, you can just force them to take a damage. I wanted to include Draconic Kaiser Warning because the blood is coming back, and so if you're playing a Draconic Kaiser Vermilion deck, you may be interested in this. It just does very Draconic Kaiser things by battling multiple units in your opponent's board, and it gives plus 5k buffs to your rearguards for everything you hit. For Eradicators, specifically Descendant, I also wanted to toss in Zillion, who basically is just Descendant. At the end of his battle, if he didn't hit, you restand him and you lose a drive check. For G-Guards, Narukami has some very dumb options. Impede Dragon retires up to 2 cards on your opponent's board. Your opponent's choice though, you don't get to choose. We also have Bulwark Dragon, who gains 10k shield and retires one of your opponent's rested rearguards at the end of battle for every 4 cards in bind zone. And lastly, Brahma, who just gains 10k shield and also fuels the bind zone. In Nubatama, we have Jakumeso, last year's Premium Collection Stride. When he attacks, he draws you 2 cards, bounces your board, and lets you call 2 cards, and if you called 2, he gains 10k and a crit. 2019's Premium Collection Stride for Nubatama is Mujin Lord Dagoku. This option kind of depends on what your opponent's playing. He just calls 2 cards from your opponent's G-Zone to their board under your control, and their auto abilities activate as if they were on Vanguard, and you attack your opponent's Vanguard with them. We also have Mukuro, who forces your opponent to attack their own board with their Vanguard, so you can just board wipe your opponent. We also have the original Mujin Lord, who does the exact opposite. He gives a 4k buff to your opponent's board and makes their rearguards attack their Vanguard 1 by 1. I also wanted to include Rene, but it's important to note that if you're going to be playing Jamio Congo in Premium, you cannot use Rene with Jamio Congo, but if you're a man of culture and you don't play Jamio Congo, then you can play Rene. He forces your opponent to call 2 cards from their hand, and if you have enough face-up cards in your G-Zone, they'll get plus 15k and a crit, and they'll attack your opponent's Vanguard 1 by 1. I also wanted to include Tsukumo Rakan. It's basically a Jamio for non-Jamio decks, but only for the turn. Into G-Guardians, we have Zashiki Hime. It makes your opponent discard, or else she'll gain 20k shield. We also have Geiho Rakan. This will take one of your opponent's back row grade 1 rearguards and force them to guard for you. Lastly, we have Gandoku Rakan, who gains 5 to 15k shield depending on your hand size. Now we'll look at Link Joker and their massive amount of archetype specific support. Starting off though, we'll look at Glue Ball Avalanche, your 2019 Premium Collection Stride. His main effect is that if you have 2 of him face up in your G-Zone, when your opponent's cards would unlock, they're actually bound face down instead. And his other skill is that he locks 2 of your opponent's rear guards and gives a power buff for each of your opponent's locked cards to your board. Next, we have another kind of tech option from last year's Premium Collection of Barrio and Dragon. I don't know why they didn't just name it Vario and Dragon, but you know, here we are. And the main thing you need to know about him is that he just eats gifts. So if your opponent's like spamming a ton of force gifts to the field, a ton of Excel markers or whatever, he just gets rid of all of them. Next, we have Amnesty Messiah, who, as far as I can tell, is mostly useful for Messiahs. He essentially will just let you play standard Messiah. We also have Basaltis Messiah, who will lock or unlock 2 for every face-up card you have in your G-Zone. So this is your units or your opponent's units. We also have Integral Messiah, who you will use as a hard hand reset for both you and your opponent. Pretty good if your opponent has just sitting on a ton of hand cards. For Chaos-specific support, since we know Chaos Breaker is going to come back, we have Chaos Universe. He forces your opponent to call a card from their hand as a locked card, and at GB2, he will lock another card on your opponent's board. We also have Chaos Universe Alfani. He locks 2 of your opponent's rear guards, and if they can only lock 1 or none, you draw 2 cards instead. And then we have Chaos Breaker Deluge, who forces your opponent to call 2 cards from hand to the board as locked cards, and if their damage is 4 or less, you can move one of those locked cards to their damage zone. For deleters, we have Audayan, whatever. Just a very free delete your opponent's Vanguard. And we also have Igorg, who I wanted to include because he has a very interesting alternate win condition where if your opponent has 4 or more damage and 13 or more face down cards in the bind zone, you just automatically win the game. I just find alternate win conditions like this interesting to build around, so I just wanted to include it here as well. Into G Guardians, we have Cosmo Wreath, who is like the Denial Griffin for Link Joker in a way. He locks one of your opponent's back row rear guards during their turn. We also have Genesis Beast Destiny Guardian. Pretty restrictive on the requirements here. You have to unlock 2 cards either on your board or your opponent's, but if you do, he gains 10k shield. We also have Desthurgeon, who when placed, if there's 2 locked cards, lets you draw a card. We also have Lacus, whatever. She will lock up to 3 in your back row and then the same amount on your opponent's board. And lastly, we have Lady Healer, which if you're playing Messiah, gains 10k shield. Looking at Pale Moon now, Pale Moon is one of those clans that really benefited from the premium collection, in which that's its main game plan now. The first stride we have is Dark Lord Princess. At the end of her battle, she de-strides herself, and then you choose something from your G-Zone with the Magi ability, stride that, and it loses 2 drive checks, and then you call her to your board, so just a ton of multi-attacking. We also have Yvette, who you will probably go into after Dark Lord Princess. She gives you an Excel circle on attack and calls a unit from the soul, and you give that unit plus 15k. We also have Masquerade Master Harry, who is another option for you to call with Dark Lord Princess. Just a very good multi-attacker, lets you call 3 cards from Soul on attack. I also wanted to include the GB8 because with all of the G-Zone flipping you'll do with the striding and restriding, you can probably go into it. It lets you call 5 cards from your Soul and give them plus 5k and the Abyss Dragon race, and then herself will get plus 10k for each Abyss Dragon you have on board, so it can just get really, really big, be an interesting closer to a game. Looking at G-Guardians, we have Coulthard, who just gets really big shield, 15k. Furnival gives you a selective soul charge from the top 3 cards of your deck, and if it was a grade 1 or greater, you get 5k shield. And lastly, we have Wandering Dragon, who gives you a soul charge and then lets you guard with a card from your soul, so that can get to some very big numbers. Now, looking at Granblue. Granblue is nice and easy. Really, we're just gonna look at both premium collection strides because all the other options basically do what your premium collection strides will do for you, but not necessarily as good, especially if you're only going to be playing a standard deck with these cards. Obadiah lets you search your deck for 5 specific cards, mill them, and then call 2. For Granblue, that's just insane. Bad Bounty, at the end of his battle, lets you re-ride a grade 3 from your drop zone as stand, so just can play your typical standard deck with an extra Vanguard attack. Looking at G-Guards, we have Negranora. She guards with 2 different grades from your drop zone, so you can get some very big shield on that. We have Negro Lily, who calls a ghosty from drop zone and gets plus 10k shield. This is the card that enables Granblue's new hand trap. We also have Deep Corpse Dragon, who doesn't gain more shield than the heal trigger you'll use to call it, but he does mill you 2 cards, and that's always welcome in Granblue. And lastly, we have Negro Mode, who gets up to 15k shield depending on the size of your drop zone. Next, we have Bermuda Triangle. First, we have Shandy, who will call you at least 2 cards from the top 10 cards of your deck on attack, and will call more if you decide to build with more Harmony keyword units in Premium. And if you have 6 units in Harmony, it will gain a crit for each face-up card in your G-Zone. Next, we have Olivia, who is pretty generically useful, but will be the most useful in a Highlander build. On attack, you can choose at least 3 of your rear guards with different names, up to 5. You bounce those to your hand and then call 2. And she also gains a crit. Next, we have Anj. She will bounce as many cards as you like from both you and your opponent's boards. She'll gain 5k for each. If you bounced 5, you draw a card, and if you bounce 7, you gain an extra drive check. Next, we have Tirua. Why is that so hard to say? Tirua. At the end of her battle, you can tuck 3 of your rear guards to the bottom of your deck. She'll restand and lose 2 drive checks. And if you're playing this in a Chocho deck, all of your front row units with Chocho and their card names will get plus 5k for all of your open circles. So you can very easily give a 15k buff to your front row. Speaking of Chocho support, we have Lapria. On attack, she'll tuck 2 of your rear guards to the bottom of your deck for each face-up card you have in your G-Zone. You draw for each one you tuck, and you'll draw another if your heart card is a Chocho. And if you drew 4, you can call up to 5 cards from your hand. On the Prism side of things, we have Vert. At the end of battle, you can bounce 2 of your Prism units, destride, and ride a grade 3 Prism from your hand as stand. We also have Kaname. On attack, you can bounce 2 of your units, call 2 cards with Prism in their card name for each face-up card in your G-Zone, and if you call 3 or more, she gets a crit. Why does Bermuda have to have such complicated skills? Next, we have Riviere. You choose a rear guard for each Riviere card you have in your soul, and they get plus 5k. And if you have 3 or more cards face up in G-Zone, you draw a card, she gets plus 10k and a crit. Also wanted to include Coral in case you're playing a Coral deck. Oh my god, this is so much text. Even condensing this is hard. On attack, you soul charge. For each Coral you have in soul, you bounce a rear guard, and she gets plus 5k for each. And if you have 2 or more of these face up in your G-Zone, you draw 2 and call 2 cards. And lastly, this is last, right? Yes, okay. Lastly, we have Federica, who is going to be in a Highlander build. You reveal 10 cards on the top of your deck. If all of them have different names, you can choose 6 different mermaids from your G-Zone, call them to your rear guard. They all get plus 15k and can attack from the back row. Looking at G-Guardians, we have Sandy, who will get plus 5k for every 2 cards you have in hand, and then you can counterblast for an additional 5k if you want. Then we have Leona, who will bounce a card on your board and then call a card from your hand. And lastly, we have Citron, who just gets plus 10k shield. Thank God that's all in Bermuda. Now, something much easier to comprehend, we have Megacolony. First, we have 2019's Premium Collection Stride of Ghidorah. She will basically cancel out your opponent's stand phase and makes it so your opponent can only call cards from hand. And on attack, she will toolbox a grade 3 from your deck to rear guard and give it plus 10k. Next, we have Overwhelm, who will draw you cards equal to the amount of rested units your opponent has, and if they only have 1, you will gain a crit and a drive. And at GB3 during your turn, it will give plus 2k power for every counterblasted damage your opponent has. We have Obturandus, who just makes it so your opponent can't call units to rear guard. Superior calls included. For machinings, I wanted to include Machining Destroyer. He stuns an opponent's rear guard, makes it so they can't stand, and also your opponent's Vanguard. We also have Despo, who will stand all of your machinings and then stun 2 of your opponent's rear guards for each one that stood. And then we have this card. Don't play this card. I just like his art, and his name is funny. It's Staggle Dipper. And I don't know when else I would be able to talk about it, so there he is. G-Guards, we have Relish Lady. Your opponent will have the choice to rest 2 rear guards, and if they don't, you draw a card, countercharge, and soul charge. Then we have Grisfort. He will rest your opponent's back row, or she, maybe it's a she. Rest your opponent's back row, and for every 2 units your opponent has in rest, will gain 5k shield. And lastly, we have Morphosian, who is just a 10k shield gainer. Looking at Great Nature now, we have Managammer Arum. He mills 4 from the top of your deck, and for every normal unit will gain 10k, and for every trigger gains a drive check. And when he's face up in G zone, when something attacks, you can Soul Blast 1 and call a card from your hand to rearguard. We also have last year's Premium Collection Stride, who I'm not even going to try to pronounce. Whenever a card is put from your deck to drop zone or rearguard to drop zone, it goes on the bottom of your deck instead, so this can help keep you from decking out. And whenever a rearguard attacks, you can Soul Blast 1, flip up a G unit, and give that rearguard plus 5k, and at the end of the battle, you retire it. This reminds me a lot of Bustard from Nova Grappler, and can let you turbo into the GB8. Speaking of the GB8, we have Sahasrara Vera. It gives 5 of your rearguards 10k, and at the end of the turn, you retire them. And if you have 1 or less card in hand, he gets plus 40k and a crit. Next, we have the original Mannergamer. He gives 2 of your rearguards 4k power, and when they attack, if their power is 20k or greater, they give a grade 1 or greater guard restrict. Then we have Balarl. Gives your front row an on-hit draw and plus 4k for every face-up card in your G-zone, and you retire them at the end of your turn. Next, we also have a really interesting option, and honestly, this card made me kind of want to play Great Nature. Fernigus, at the end of your turn, he nukes your board and then lets you draw and countercharge and soul charge for every unit retired. And to G-Guardians, we have Spangled. This card is really good. When it's placed, you choose all of your other Guardians, and when they're retired from Guardian Circle, you get to draw a card, so you can just recycle a ton of cards, cycle out a bunch of cards. We have Ardillo, who is our 10k shield gainer. We have All Mirage, who gives 4 of your rear guards resist, and if they're hit, they don't die. And Sunculpa, who gives plus 4k to your Vanguard and a rear guard for each of your open circles, and if they reach 20k, you get to draw a card. Finally, we're in the home stretch now. Lastly, we're going to be looking at Neo Nectar. And really, in Neo Nectar, there's only one stride you need to worry about, and that's Sandrine. She just superior strides herself in the main phase and gives you plus 10k and a crit. I was going to include things like a Maiden of stride or 2, or maybe a Musketeer stride, even an Arboro stride, but honestly, why would you use those when you can just play your current deck and then gain 10k crit and a drive check? So those are definitely options. So if you want to spice your deck up with a little bit more flavor of the archetype you're playing, feel free. But really, all you need to worry about is that one stride. Looking at the G-Guards though, we have Costarina, who will gain up to 10k shield. We have Verna, who will gain up to 20k shield. Antario, who is a Musketeer, but can be used with other things besides Musketeer, who will also gain up to 20k shield. And lastly, Marlena, who is most useful if you're playing Asha, and she will gain 15k shield. Neo Nectar just has a lot of high shield G-Guardians. Well, that's all the clans. Thank you for sticking by as I got my way through them. If for some reason, like I said at the beginning, you haven't seen the ZeroDamageGaming article, go give that a look. That will get you past where I've covered, because this was just focused on you building a G-Zone and putting it on your standard deck and going to play games of premium. Also, one thing I wanted to make sure I made clear too, because this was brought up to me in the comments of my last video, most of these you do not need play sets for. Most of this is just you like getting 1 or 2, sometimes 3 copies of something, depending on how important it is, and having a toolbox that you can pull from when you're playing games in premium. That being said though, thank you so much for all the support and everything you guys have been doing. It means so much to me. It's really cool to see, and all of this just out of nowhere is really cool. So thank you so much for all that. Make sure to subscribe and like and share and all the YouTube-y stuff. And also, I want to shout out my Twitch. I streamed last Thursday, I think it was, for the Overdress announcement, and it was a lot of fun, just talking Vanguard and Premium and the reboot with everybody. I'm planning on doing that more, so if you would like to drop by and hang out sometime, drop me a follow over there. You'll know when I go live, and we can just hang out, and maybe we'll watch some old English dub openings of anime. That was an off-topic thing we did, so it was a lot of fun. I'd like to do that more, so head over there if you'd like. Until next time.